Well, hello and welcome to week number 12. This week you'll watch part 5 of the PBS production of God in America. Part 5 explores the post World War II era when rising evangelist Billy Graham tried to inspire a religious revival that fused faith with patriotism in a Cold War battle with quote unquote godless communism. As you know, while Americans flocked in record numbers to houses of worship, non-believers and religious minorities appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court to test the constitutionality of religious expression in public schools. And civil rights leader Martin Luther King emerged as a modern-day prophet, calling upon the nation to honor both biblical teachings and the founders' democratic ideals of equal justice. So we'll cover the first part of the video this week and continue into next week with Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. The 1930s and 40s were trying times indeed. A global economic crisis gave way to a global war that became the deadliest and most destructive in human history. Perhaps 80 million individuals lost their lives during World War II. And the war saw industrialized genocide on a scale that had never been seen before. It also unleashed the most fearsome technology ever used with the use of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And when World War II ended, the United States found itself alone as the world's greatest superpower. So armed with the world's greatest economy, it looked forward to the fruits of a prosperous consumer's economy. But the war raised as many questions as it would settle, and it unleashed new social forces at home and abroad that confronted generations of Americans to come. And one question that we had to grapple with was the internment of Japanese Americans during the war. 30,000 Japanese Americans had fought for the United States in World War II, but wartime anti-Japanese sentiment built on historical prejudices. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the removal of any persons from designated exclusion zones, which ultimately covered nearly a third of the country. Now, under this order, over 10,000 German nationals and smaller numbers of Italian nationals were interned at various times in the United States during World War II, but American policies disproportionately targeted Japanese-descended populations, and individuals did not receive personalized reviews prior to their internment. So people of Japanese descent, both immigrants and American citizens, were detained and placed under the custody of the War Relocation Authority. And this was the civil agency that supervised relocation to internment camps. These people lost their homes and their jobs, and this policy of mass exclusion and detention affected over 100,000 Japanese and Japanese-descended individuals. 70,000 were American citizens. So this week you will read how Buddhists, the majority of the Japanese American community, were particularly singled out during this period of internment. So the theme for this week is nationalism. And nationalism is a modern concept that has sometimes been described as a religion. In fact, political scientist Frank Wright said, quote, "Nationalisms are not merely like religions, they are religions," unquote. So with this in mind, think about the ways in which the United States paired religious symbolism with national symbols during the Cold War. Was this a new thing, or can you see this pairing since the inception of the United States? How influential was nationalism in the United States? So keep in mind the first modern nation states were Spain, England, and France, the three nations that colonized the Americas. And also, the United States was the first modern nation to win independence through a successful revolution against colonial rule. And it inspired revolutions across the world, which continued for several decades as revolts rocked both the Americas and Europe. Individuals on both sides of the Atlantic were forced to reconsider the relationship between religion, society, and government. And despite secular achievements and developments, religion continued to hold sway with many. I want you to think about how feelings of patriotism and nationalism intertwine with religion. You'll read sociologist Robert Bella's 1967 essay, Civil Religion in America, in which he argued that the United States had, quote, an elaborate and well-instituted civil religion, unquote, which existed alongside of and was rather clearly differentiated from the churches. Also known as civic piety, religious nationalism, public religion, and common faith, civil religion, according to Bella, provided a religious sanction for the political order and a divine justification of and support for civic society and nation's practices. He said it was the, quote, state's use of consensus religious sentiments, concepts, and symbols for its own purposes, unquote. And last but not least, he said, quote, as a system of established rituals, symbols, values, norms, and allegiances, civil religion functions as a social glue to bind people together and give them an overarching sense of spiritual unity, unquote. And a sense of spiritual unity was especially important during the Cold War. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union soon began to deteriorate after World War II ended in 1946. And less than a year after the end of the war, George Kennan sent his famous telegram, referred to as the Long Telegram, to the State Department denouncing the Soviet Union. He said, quote, world communism is like a malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue. And the steady advance of uneasy Russian nationalism is the new guise of international Marxism. It is more dangerous and insidious than ever before, unquote. There could be, according to Kennan, there could be no cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, the Soviets had to be, quote unquote, contained. And less than 2 weeks later, Winston Churchill visited President Harry Truman and declared that Europe had been cut in half, divided by an iron curtain that had descended across the continent. So the Cold War had begun, and aggressive anti-Soviet sentiment seized the American government and soon the American people. Now, during this time, Joseph McCarthy burst onto the national scene with a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, on February 9th, 1950. Waving a sheet of paper in the air, he proclaimed, quote, I have here in my hand a list of 205 names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping U.S. policy, unquote. And since the Wisconsin Republican had no actual list, when pressed, the number changed to 57 and then later 81. Finally, he promised to disclose the name of just one communist, the nation's top Soviet agent. So these shifting numbers brought ridicule, but it didn't matter. McCarthy's claims won him fame and fueled the ongoing Red Scare. Joseph B. Matthews was an important witness for Senator Joe McCarthy, testifying before congressional committees. He had the advantage of personal experience as an organizer for Communist Front organizations before World War II. And J.B. Matthews took pains to explain that naive and busy people of goodwill, and this included many clergymen, were often duped into signing petitions and lending their names to what appeared as ostensibly good causes. They were unaware that the leading personalities in these organizations were fronting for the Communist Party. So in June of 1953, Matthews was appointed as McCarthy's research director, and in July he published an article called Reds in Our Churches. This was in American Mercury magazine. And in this article, Matthews referred to the Protestant clergy as, quote, the largest single group supporting the communist apparatus in the United States, unquote. And you'll read this, Reds in Our Churches. I have included this in your primary sources. As a result of this, public outrage was directed at Matthews as well as Senator McCarthy. So McCarthyism was a symptom of a massive and widespread anti-communist hysteria that engulfed Cold War America. And only 2 years after World War II, President Truman, facing growing anti-communist excitement and with a tough election on the horizon, gave in to pressure and issued his loyalty order in March of 1947, Executive Order 9835. And this established loyalty reviews for federal employees The FBI conducted closer examinations of all potential security risks among Foreign Service officers. And in Congress, the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations held hearings on communist influence in American society. And McCarthy, in his Wheeling speech, had called for an all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. And Cold Warriors in the United States routinely referred to a fundamental incompatibility between godless communism and God-fearing Americanism. Religious conservatives championed the idea of the traditional nuclear God-fearing family as a bulwark against the spread of atheistic totalitarianism. And as Baptist minister Billy Graham sermonized in 1950, communism aimed to, quote, destroy the American home and cause, leading to moral deterioration, unquote. And this would leave the country exposed to communist infiltration. During the first term of the Eisenhower administration, the role of American churches in politics became a major issue. In an atmosphere in which ideas of national belonging and citizenship were so closely linked to religious commitment, Americans during the early Cold War years attended church, professed a belief in a supreme being, and stressed the importance of religion in their lives at higher rates than in any time in American history. Americans sought to differentiate themselves from godless communists through public displays of religiosity. Politicians infused government with religious symbols. The Pledge of Allegiance was altered to include the words "One Nation Under God" in 1954. "In God We Trust" was adopted as the official national motto in 1956. And in popular culture, one of the most popular films of the decade, Ten Commandments, it retold the biblical Exodus as a Cold War parable. And this echoed NSC 68. And if you don't know what NSC 68 is, you should, and I've included the link in your list of sources for this week. So it echoed NSC 68 in its characterization of the Soviet Union as a slave state. Monuments of the Ten Commandments went up at courthouses and city halls all across the country. So while the link between American nationalism and religion grew much closer during the Cold War, many Americans began to believe that just believing in almost any religion was better than being an atheist. So gone were the overt anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic language of Protestants in the past. Now leaders spoke of a common Judeo-Christian heritage. In December 1952, a month before his inauguration, Dwight Eisenhower said that, quote, "Our form of government makes no sense unless it is founded on a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is," unquote. Southern evangelist Billy James Hargis of Christian Crusade hosted a popular radio and television ministry which peaked in the 1950s and 60s. And Billy Graham became a spiritual advisor to Eisenhower as well as a popular radio and television personality. The rise of radio and television enabled the men and women to get their message across to a larger population. And as you remember from last week's journal article on Amy Semple McPherson, she was one of the first to use the press and radio to popularize her message, but she was by no means the last. So I've included links for you to look at some popular religious people at the time, and I want you to in particularly think of the role of radio and television as popularizing religion in America. In 1949, media mogul William Randolph Hearst liked Billy Graham so much that he sent a decree to his national network of editors telling them to puff Graham. You'll also hear from Norman Vincent Peale. He was an American minister and author known for his work in popularizing the concept of positive thinking, especially through his best-selling book, The Power of Positive Thinking. And I've included a link for you to look at that. Fulton John Sheen was another popular personality. He was an American bishop, later Archbishop of the Catholic Church. He was known for his preaching and especially his work on television and radio. And Garfield Bromley Oxnam was a social reformer and American bishop in the Methodist Episcopal Church. And Oxenham took a slightly controversial position against the Cold War. He opposed compulsory military training in the military reserves in peacetime for fear of how the rigors of military training in life can affect a man's thinking and philosophy. He also opposed the use of the atomic bomb by saying, quote, "There is something morally wrong with a weapon who destroys humanity," unquote. He was accused of being a communist and appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee on July 21st, 1953. And during this time, he was extensively questioned about his communist sympathies and his relations with other accused communists. And at this time, many of the false accusations from his campaign for the Los Angeles School Board resurfaced as evidence against him. And while Oxenham repudiated these accusations and offered counter evidence to disprove accusations, he was charged with working with the industrial workers of the world and had spoken at rallies at various locations, basically accused of being a radical and a communist. So I've included his testimony for you to look at, so you can kind of parse that out for yourself. So that's it. We're getting close to the end of the semester, so please remember to check your syllabus. Précis number 4, Mark Noll's God and Race in American Politics, is due on April 21st, so please keep that in mind. And begin reading your final book for Précis number 5, which is Matthew Avery Sutton, Jerry Falwell and the Rise of the Religious Right. Also, read in your textbook, Gustad, the page 329 to 348. Remember to post to the Week 12 discussion forum. Please post by this Friday, and then by Sunday, April 21st, please respond to a couple of your classmates' posts. So we are at Week 12, only a few more weeks to go. So please contact me if you have any questions, if you have any concerns. It's particularly important at this stage to keep in contact with me if you have been a little bit behind. So anyway, have a great week, and I will talk to you soon.